Ms Cohen.
My lady, thank you. May I please call Miss Indra Morris?
Repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the
the
truth,
whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please. Thank you.
Thank you for coming to help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Morris. You have provided a witness statement to the inquiry. I think you have it in front of you. And the reference for it is INQ 000588009. You signed that statement, I think, on the 1st of August 2025. Can you please confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
Thank you. Ms. Morris, at the time of the pandemic, you were the Director General for Strategy, Disadvantage and Social Mobility at the Department for Education, a post that you had held since 2017. And we understand that your remit in that role included children's social care, special educational needs and disabilities, behaviour and attendance, and that during the pandemic you came to hold the role of Senior Responsible Officer for the Vulnerable Children's Unit across government workstream. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And Ms Morris, we understand that you left the civil service in June 2023 and you're currently the chair of a social mobility charity. Is that right?
Yes, I'm effectively retired with a couple of roles, non-executive roles.
Thank you. Before we begin your evidence, I think it would be right to acknowledge that in your statement you express reservations about the use of the term vulnerable, both in principle to describe vulnerable children and in the way that it was used during the pandemic. Can you explain why, please?
It's partly due to conversations I've had with children and young people themselves after the pandemic about their sense that it defined them rather than reflecting the fact that they were experiencing issues and challenges and adversity that wasn't to do with them, that was outside their control. And I think I said in my statement, there's a sort of language perspective, but there's also, as we saw, and we'll maybe come on to later in respect of attendance, the association of stigma and is this me? What does it say about me? And should I attend school? Or do I even associate with the language? So, yeah.
We'll come on, as you say, to talk about that particular policy in some more detail. But in your mind, would there be a better way of describing this group of children other than using the term vulnerable children?
Well, again, I think there's a conversation to be had with children and young people, and some of those conversations that I've had has been about the request to describe them as facing or experiencing adversity or disadvantage, or even perhaps more neutrally, children in need of support or receiving support.
I see. Thank you. During your evidence, we will continue to use the term vulnerable children simply because that was the contemporary term.
Yeah, and it had its advantages at the time.
Ms Morris, we have heard from a number of witnesses in this module so far that in their view there was an insufficient focus across government on children, and some have said that insofar as the Department for Education is the location of much of the business of children's lives in government, it perhaps did not have a big enough voice beyond its own immediate remit. We understand from your statement that part of what was novel about the work that your work stream did was that it sought to do exactly that, to work right across government. Is that right? Is it fair to describe it as novel?
Yes, to a point, but I think also in my statement I said we built on some pre-existing work and relationships, and those were probably strongest. For example, with the Home Office, where we shared statutory responsibilities around safeguarding and shared interests. So they, for example, led on online harms, criminal exploitation and so forth, and there was a lot of work with them. Likewise, there was a Family Justice Board, so we worked very closely with the MOJ in the run-up to the pandemic. So I think it varied, but it was completely novel in that we hadn't worked together in the sort of extreme context of a pandemic.
Thank you. And I think we understand from your statement that you first established the Vulnerable Children's Unit within your group, so within the Department for Education, on the 17th of March, 2020, but that a short time later, you say you think it may have been around the 26th of March, you suggested at a Cabinet Office meeting that there needed to be more of a focus across government on protecting children during the pandemic, and you felt that you were told that it was unlikely that that would be a focus. Can you explain that, please? What was it that you were suggesting and why?
I think my question, and I'm sorry that I can't remember exactly which meeting it was, but it will have been a gathering of Director Generals and Permanent Secretaries with the leads from the senior Cabinet Office, was basically, what about children? I mean, it was a very simple kind of question. And the response was basically, we're focusing on a health pandemic. Children are not at the same risk, not at risk in the same way. Okay.
We understand from your statement that then on the 4th of April, you were appointed the Senior Responsible Officer. And I think I understand that at some point in its lifetime, the Vulnerable Children Unit was reoriented to be reporting to the Cabinet Office.
That's not, on the reporting, that's not quite right, and maybe I should come back to that. But yeah, we set up the Vulnerable Children's Unit, as you said, before I was appointed SRO. We didn't know what was coming, but we knew and got a sense that it would be fluid and uncertain, that we needed to think about how we could coordinate effectively across government for vulnerable children. I was appointed as SRO in an email.
Forgive me, I'm sorry. For those not acquainted with the structures of the civil service,
yes.
Is there a particular significance to appointing an SRO?
Sorry, so it's a Senior Responsible Officer, and it is essentially the term used quite widely to describe who is responsible for delivering on something specific. And the Cabinet Office appointed about 40 Senior Responsible Officers across government in a range of issues. 2 were in the Department for Department for Education. 1 in schools, who was charged with keep creating places for key worker children. And I was appointed SRO for vulnerable children, but solely with safeguarding. There was no mention in that of attendance. And we went back the same day and basically redrew that and inserted attendance of vulnerable children. It was not unusual. That was the approach at the time. Cabinet Office were holding the ring and did throughout, in terms of they were, if you like, the clearinghouse for decisions and coordination for the COVID response. So that wasn't entirely that. It didn't stop the fact that within DFE there was also governance, there was a COVID board, and also we set up our own dedicated vulnerable children governance too.
I see. So just so that I'm sure I understand, your unit would be sitting within DFE, working across government, escalating issues up to Cabinet Office, is that right?
Yeah, shared as well with the governance in place at the time, which changed over time within DFE. So we were all, sharing information across the department.
I see. Thank you. And you suggest in your statement that you think the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster, then Sir Michael Gove, and his advisor, whom you say you think was on loan from the Office of the Children's Commissioner, may have had some role in the rethink about the focus to be placed on children. Is that right?
Well, I may be drawing too much into a coincidence, but I had some direct contact from that advisor when she either gone on loan or was about to go on loan from the Office of the Children's Commissioner. So, I saw that as a sort of positive.
I see. And you felt you had some element of endorsement in that work from Sir Michael Gove, is that right?
I wouldn't go as far as that. I didn't get a sort of explicit, but the fact that that advisor had gone back and was working for him on secondment,
I see.
And had a history and had been in touch with me about vulnerable children, I saw as encouraging.
Thank you. To help us then understand the initial work of that unit, can we please look at INQ 000540850? This was, I think, or was this a sort of presentation of your work stream on the 17th of April 2020?
It was. This was, and forgive me, I can't remember all the acronyms. This was this was a Cabinet Office convened ministerial meeting, and that was one of the key mechanisms for discussion and decision. And Vicky Ford, who was then Minister for Children and Families, attended and presented for us. And the VCU, the Vulnerable Children's Unit, will have produced this
Thank
pack
you.
for her.
I think you said it was a key mechanism for discretion and decision. What does that mean?
Sorry, I meant discussion and decision.
I see, I'm sorry, that's my
Apologies.
error.
No, that's
not
my
at all. Thank you.
clumsiness.
If we can look then, please, at page 2 of this, we see under objectives what the purpose of this presentation was. We see it was to provide an update, to share the Vulnerable Children dashboard, and to ask for support from other departments. Was this updating the Cabinet Office then? Is this an illustration of, as we say, sitting in the DFE but reporting up?
This was a meeting where other government department ministers were at. So Cabinet Office convened it, and Cabinet Office would have been there, but the Home Office, I'll be honest, I haven't gone back and looked at who actually attended, but other government departments. This was not us having a bilateral conversation with the Cabinet Office. This was a cross-government ministerial meeting.
Thank you. Can we look then, please, at page 3? We see the structure here of your work, so looking first at attendance, then at safeguarding, then at recovery. And I think you've told us that it was you who went back and said, actually, we need to include attendance. Yeah. Is that because you saw attendance as part of safeguarding in these circumstances?
Yes, but also it just seemed odd that there was no mention of the attendance of vulnerable children in either the school's SRO remit or mine, given Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary had secured the agreement to keep schools open for those children.
You say it seemed odd. Is that an oversight, or does it perhaps denote a lack of understanding?
It's hard for me to say. Possibly a bit of both, but that's a bit speculative on my part.
Thank you. And we understand that subsequently you redesigned these pillars so that you had, I think it was well-being and attainment instead of recovery, so separated.
That was from June,
last.
from June 2020.
Thank you. Can we look then, please, at page 8 of this same presentation? This is, I think, a illustration, as you understood it at that stage, of the scope and scale of the task of this unit. And if we can look particularly at the bottom line here, we see the numbers of children whom you understood to be in various categories of vulnerability. I want to ask you about the number of 1.9 million, so the estimate of children living in high-risk households. Are you able to help us, please, with what living in high-risk households means then?
Yes, and this was the front page, or one of the front pages of the dashboard that we'd specifically created for vulnerable children, that allowed us to see a snapshot of the national picture and then look at individual local authorities and a number of factors. This data and the narrow measure refers to work that the Children's Commissioner had done specifically around what's called the toxic trio. I think the work was 2018. My apologies if that's a year or so out. And this was recognising that the number of children who live in a household where an adult has at least one issue, for example, and the toxic trio, which are recognised as potential drivers for the need for support and intervention of care system, domestic violence, parental mental health, parental substance abuse. There's it's called narrow measure there. We had a discussion with the Office of the Children's Commissioner analysts because they owned this data, and we wanted to have comparable data. So the 1.9 reflected the data they'd used that we could correlate, if you like, with our local authority level data, which is what we were doing.
We had evidence at close to the beginning of these hearings from Baroness Longfield about her data in the Childhood Vulnerability in England report from 2019. The figure that that report had given for children living in at-risk families was 2.3 million. Had you, do you think, taken a narrower measure then of her headline figure?
We did, but again, it comes back to the point that this 1.9 was reflected the local authority level data. So there was a kind of technical analyst discussion about whether we were talking about on similar terms. I think there's a wider issue and a wider challenge from the Children's Commissioner about whether we cast the definition of vulnerable too narrowly, full stop. But actually, I think in this case, it was a very sensible decision about data.
It would seem at first blush as though around 400,000 children somewhere fell out between her count of 2.3 and your count of 1.9. Is that right, or are we misunderstanding?
I think it comes back to going into the pandemic, there wasn't, if you like, a sort of government-recognised definition of vulnerable children. For the purposes of the pandemic, and particularly for the purposes of attendance, we focused on children in need and children within EHCP, who were the children that DfE in particular had responsibility for. In a safeguarding perspective, we recognised there were also children that we didn't know about, and that's where the hidden harms work came in. The Children's Commissioner had a completely legitimate view, but it wasn't the one that government took, which was there's a much wider group of children here. And that's where I think that comes in.
So do you think hers is a legitimate challenge then?
It's a legitimate challenge, but I think for the purposes of attendance, I think at that point in the pandemic, when we at one point didn't know if we were actually going to get agreement to anything other than key worker children going into school, and it wasn't clear what the capacity of schools and their ability to open and support children was. I think we took a sort of a principled and sensible approach. That doesn't mean she doesn't have a legitimate challenge, and there is obviously this wider question about wider vulnerabilities and impacts. But I think for the purposes of attendance, but also, as I said, for safeguarding, we weren't bound or limited to children with educational, health and care plans or children in need.
I see, thank you. Can we look, please, then at page 6 of this same document? This tells us what I think you were presenting then in mid-April as the support that you needed from other government departments. And we see, Ms. Morris, that's quite wide-ranging. So if we look, please, at number 1, safeguarding all vulnerable children and young people, we see that you were asking for support across DfE, Department for Health and Social Care, and the Home Office. You were also asking for support from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government related to the Troubled Families Programme. Lower down on supporting vulnerable families, there was help needed from the Cabinet Office, DEFRA, Department of Health and Social Care, and also the Ministry of Justice related to the family courts. Moving down to the third point, we see again Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government, and Her Majesty's Treasury, and more detail further down, including at the bottom, we need the support of the Department for Work and Pensions. And I think pausing there, not on this slide, but apparent from your statement, it also became clear that you needed the support from the Home Office related to the registration of births, also further support from the Ministry of Justice related to the education of children in youth offending institutions, and elsewhere mention of the Department for Culture, Media and Sports on youth services. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
It's quite clear from that, Ms. Morris, that, as we said at the beginning, the location of responsibilities to do with aspects of children's lives was spread very widely across government. How did that affect your ability to do your role for children in these emergency circumstances?
I think it's fair to say it's probably worth reflecting that this list was drawn up in consultation with colleagues across government who attended at the beginning daily sit reps with the situation reports, basically sort of huddles on what we were learning with the VCU, but also from our discussions with external stakeholders and charity CEOs and others. So we were trying to sort of pull together. Some of these things will have been things that colleagues in other government departments will say, can you kind of advocate and help bolster our case for support? And we saw some of that translate earlier in the year. The concern about babies under 1 and the Home Office under item 1, for example, was very well shared with the Home Office at that time. So, yeah, sorry, I think I might have slightly lost track of your
Not at all. Let me ask you more
question.
specifically. Let me ask you more specifically by reference to what you say in your statement. One of the things you say is that due to the lack of an existing cross-government plan or structure for a pandemic, cooperation on issues affecting vulnerable children was reliant on goodwill and finding good people in different departments.
Yeah.
Does that indicate that if you couldn't find someone in a particular department who was receptive to your concern, it would be hard to progress things with that department?
Yes, I think the fundamental failure was the lack of pre-pandemic planning. I think as SRO, in hindsight, I wish I had, and I think I mentioned one of these in my statement, asked for named officials in individual departments. I actually, in hindsight, also wish I'd asked for named ministers. Because I think that could have perhaps helped. We found it easier where we had a pre-existing relationship, and I mentioned the Home Office and so forth already. It was harder in departments that didn't have so much of a working relationship or didn't have such a clear pre-established agenda, so DCMS on youth, which we might come to when we talk about teens later.
So when you say you wish or you think it may have helped if you had asked for named officials and named ministers. Yeah. Again, for those not familiar with civil service processes, not at all. But what does that mean? What difference would that have made?
I think it would have said to the Cabinet Office, I think it would have told me something about where the Cabinet Office were at in terms of seeing this as something they wanted the cross-government kind of machinery and effort to focus on. And I think it would have, in some cases, it was obvious who the minister was, Victoria Atkinson, the Home Office, for example. But I think it would have also helped perhaps us kind of escalate or focus some of the conversations, whether ministerial level or official level. Although I had, my counterparts in different departments who I did go to at various points. And provided some continuity, and continuity was quite important.
So in really simple terms, it would be somebody within that department who didn't necessarily have as part of their usual day-to-day work responsibility for children, but who would be appointed to work with you on any issues that you raised. Is that
or did already and would be appointed, or if they didn't, but we felt that their department had some potential positive influence, that they would be nominated, yes, to be part of that.
Thank you. That may speak to another thing that you say in your statement, which is that departments are always most interested in the areas for which they have primary responsibility. This was particularly so in the context of the pandemic, where everyone was faced with trying to respond to the varied challenges raised in a rapidly changing factual picture. It is easier to galvanise people in a shared structure, and I felt this improved as the Vulnerable Children's Unit bedded in. So can we take it from that and what you said a moment ago, that the points you were making about children were competing for attention in other departments?
Definitely, yes.
Thank you. And if we can just please explore an example of how you were or perhaps were not able to raise an issue that you felt was of importance. Can we look, please, at INQ 000624437? This is an email of the 19th of November 2020, so quite some way into the work of the Vulnerable Children's Unit. And it appears to me, please correct me if I'm wrong, as if this is part of regular reporting on the delivery of the programme from your unit to the Cabinet Office. We see SRO summary, delivery confidence reflects cohort vulnerability to seasonal risk and restrictions, and so on. Vulnerable children attendance falling, and so on. We see lower down, developing bespoke escalation for LAs that hit threshold levels or self-report concerns. And we'll come on to look at some of that in a moment. But if we can look then at the following box, escalations. Is this the section where you would tell the Cabinet Office where you needed support?
Yes.
In other departments?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And this, as you say, was sent to the Cabinet Office, but it was sent alongside the school's SRO report as well via the central DFE.
I see, thank you. And just taking that final bullet point then, here is an example.
Yeah.
Continued need for MOJ support to protect and improve family court capacity to prevent children blocked in system. What would then happen to this escalation?
I mean, that is a very good question, and sometimes one we asked ourselves. It felt to me that the Home Office, the Cabinet Office machinery, if you like, was much better at decisions that related to very pandemic-specific issues like testing or PPE, although we found that very frustrating as well. This issue, which was a pre-existing issue before the pandemic, was one that we raised continuously throughout.
And just pausing there, did you feel it was a pandemic issue as well?
I thought it was a pre-pandemic issue that was being exacerbated, and we saw that. The President of the Family Division saw that very early and moved to put some arrangements in place. This was actually I think a day before the spending review was published, and there was some funding in there to help with the justice system, including the family court recovery. But I think I was still escalating this on Christmas Eve because we were having conversations with local authorities and said, we're really struggling with placement capacity, and this backlog is having an impact. And I think you've heard also from some other witnesses about how it was for families as well.
So is the answer to the question then what would happen after you escalated it, that you would continue to work on it, but I don't want to put words in, is it fair to say you wouldn't know to what degree it was being progressed elsewhere?
I think it felt a bit like you either got a very clear decision, so for example, can we get PPE to social workers or children's homes, or you may have got a follow-up, and I think there was a meeting later that month with the task force, the Cabinet Office task force, to go through some of the kind of outstanding issues, which I think is one of your exhibits as well. Or it wouldn't be, you got a sense it wouldn't be picked up and it would be unclear. But some departments would say to us, just keep it on the table, keep the focus, because it helps strengthen their arm.
Thank you. Just before we leave these structural points, then, thank you, this can come down. It has been suggested to the inquiry that this difficulty of raising and coordinating issues across government would also be a problem in a future pandemic. And some witnesses ask the Chair to make a recommendation that there should be a cabinet-level Minister for Children or some other mechanism in order to resolve that issue. Given your experience of working to bring these issues together during the pandemic, what do you think we would need to be better prepared for this in a future pandemic?
I mean, I think that's a legitimate suggestion, but I don't think it would work on its own. The political agenda of the government matters, so what the Prime Minister decides is a priority really matters here. I think I said in my statement, you referred to it earlier, that incentives are often to kind of focus in on your own department. I think if you had a single minister, my worry would be that they would have no influence or levers over their colleagues. So you'd have to think about, for example, again, it comes back to my point about should I have asked for a named minister, named ministers too in other government departments, but not just that, some shared perhaps outcome measures, particular clarity about their duties towards children, and a kind of shared kind of agenda really supported by good data. But but again, crucially, through the lens of the child, not just the system. We have a very sector-focused, service-focused way of doing things. And I think in the past, we've had, for example, child poverty unit, there's been the social exclusion unit. Over time, there's the Minister for Women and Equalities. I think some learning about, and I haven't looked at this myself, but some learning about what has worked well and what hasn't worked in those situations could be very useful in designing something.
I see. So would you advocate for any particular structural change, or is it your position that a work stream like yours, but with greater clarity about accountability, would suffice?
In the context of a pandemic or more broadly?
In the context of any civil emergency?
Yes, I think it would be even more vital in the context of a civil emergency, particularly if it's a health pandemic where children are not seen as the kind of at same level of direct health risk.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morris, for your help on those structural points. I'd like then to come to ask you more specifically about some of the vulnerable children units' work, and first of all, with the objective of implementing the policy of getting vulnerable children into schools. Beginning then with planning for that policy, you will have seen, I think, the witness statement of Mr. Jonathan Slater provided for this module. Mr. Slater, of course, was the permanent secretary at the Department for Education in the early part of the pandemic. We don't need to go to his statement, but for the transcript, the reference for it is INQ 000588040, and it's page 9 that I'm going to ask Ms. Morris about. Mr. Slater said that prior to the 18th of March, the government's focus was on keeping schools open. Yeah. He said we were not assessing other potential implications or risks of mass closures. He said that the government's approach to schools changed completely, literally, overnight. It became clear to me and my senior DFE colleagues on the evening of the 17th of March 2020 that the government's intention was now that schools were about to close to all but key workers. And he says that the policies for vulnerable children to attend school were worked up overnight on the 17th of March 2020 and presented to Number 10 on the 18th of March 2020. Is that also your recollection, Ms. Morris, that there was very limited planning for school closures?
Yes, that's correct.
And no planning for this policy until the night of the 17th of March? We heard evidence from Sir John Coles earlier in these hearings. He described feeling some shock at that state of affairs, and he said that it was, in his opinion, a dereliction of duty, both of politicians and the department. What is your view about that?
Well, when I look back and think about the fact that my team, for example, were asked in February to do some work on what the impact for children's social care would be, I've asked myself, why didn't I spot that as a trigger, if you like, to start thinking about what planning did we need to do and think more broadly. Now, I wasn't alone in that, but actually I do think I missed an opportunity. I can't really say why we didn't see it coming. I've kind of gone over that question a number of times. COBRA, which has been mentioned a few times, does have quite a kind of culture of confidentiality sometimes. So I wonder if there wasn't the sort of dissemination, but it just wasn't. It was sort of on our radar, but it wasn't on our. There wasn't a sort of imperative or an urgency or a sense of actually what was about to hit everybody.
You referred a moment ago to your officials being asked to do some planning for children's social care.
Yeah.
Where did that request come from?
That was the Cabinet Office.
That was the
Cabinet Office. Yeah. So there was a modicum of planning, but or a modicum of first level. What might the impacts of XYZ be? But that was it. And as I said, I do reflect. Why didn't I see that as an opportunity to kind of, or a driver to convene my team earlier to kind of think through what some of the scenarios might have been.
Was there a realisation at the time, perhaps on the 17th and the 18th of March, that this was going to be enormous and there hadn't been any planning for it?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. In terms of the messaging, the public communication about the policy for vulnerable children attending school, you've already given us some of your views about the language on vulnerable children. We heard evidence last week from a director of children's services for Kent County Council specifically, who shared her view that the way that the policy was communicated, in fact, led to some anger among parents who felt that there was a punitive element to being identified as somebody who needed to send their child to school at a time when the public was being told it was safer to stay home.
Yeah.
What do you think about the early messaging on the policy?
It's very hard to reconcile a stay-at-home, save lives message with but we really care about you, so please come to school. And that anger, I recognise that anger. I had some of those conversations with parents groups myself, particularly actually in respect of children with education, care, health plans and disabilities. But yeah, no, I recognise that tension.
It may be that there's no easy answer, but what should the message have been?
I'm genuinely not sure. I wonder, there's a bit of me, and it comes back to the comms and engagements, whereas we could have thought a bit differently about how we did the level down communication, but I think it would be very hard to counter, and probably not responsible to counter and crowd out the overall public health messaging, but maybe we could have had a little bit more empathy in the tone of some of our kind of communications. We were very kind of we tried to do that in conversations, discussions, but I wonder again if we thought differently about our comms and engagement across it, whether we could have kind of acknowledged that at a more kind of at a more magnified level.
You referred a moment ago to, I think you said anger, particularly on the part of parents whose children had an education, health and care plan. Do you think that the focus on safety in the messaging may particularly have discouraged the attendance of disabled children?
Possibly. I mean, it's quite hard to disentangle. There was a sort of, school as a protective factor from a safeguarding perspective, but school also as a way of continuing provision and support for children, including those in special schools, although that's the minority of EHCP children. So, I recognise, but I think the fundamental issue is, is it safe?
So that possibility of softer messaging on the one hand. On the other hand, conceivably, attendance for some children might have been mandated. We read from the witness statement of Ms Vicky Ford, and again, I don't need to take you there, but of course Ms Ford was Minister for Children and Families at the time. She tells us that the focus of the policy was on safeguarding, but that the attendance of vulnerable children was not made mandatory because there would be some children caught by the definition who nonetheless didn't need to attend for safeguarding reasons. And she gives the example of a child potentially settled in a long-term foster care arrangement whose needs might be very well met in placement. What is your view on the possibility of mandating? Do you think it's right not to have mandated anyone's attendance?
I think it is right, actually, and I have thought about that, in a kind of, what could we have done to get more children in? And, of course, mandation was suspended for all children at that point and for a while. But I think, again, it comes back to schools in particular, local authorities know their children. They are best placed to work with the parents and carers, the social workers, the teachers to work out actually who's going to be best to come into school, and are there clinically vulnerable risks that actually mean we shouldn't be. And so I think discretion, although it has its downsides, I think that was the right thing to do.
On that point of schools and local authorities knowing their children best, one of the points that the Director of Children's Services at Kent made to us was that if local government had been consulted about the policy of vulnerable children attending, they may have been able to give some caution around the messaging and the potential anger of those families because they work so intimately with so many families who would have qualified. Do we take it from your answers to questions about planning that they're just was no thought given to consultation with local government or others?
Well, there was very little planning in central government. Good planning would have been both central government with local government and with others, not just central government on its own. So I don't think it would have changed the anger if the policy had been the same. I think we'd still needed to have worked through that. And of course, it was anger mixed with anxiety. You know, it was an incredibly scary time for parents and carers, for children and young people, and for professionals, you know, whose sort of professional lives have been thrown upside down.
Coming then to the implementation of the policy, in terms of where the responsibility lay for identifying vulnerable children and encouraging their attendance at school, we've already seen during these hearings that the Department for Education's guidance situated that responsibility jointly with schools and with local authorities. I won't ask you to look at it. I expect you're very familiar with it. And we know that it became your unit's job to support that exercise. Was it then a surprise for the department, for the Vulnerable Children's Unit, to find that in March and April and May so few children were attending?
I'm not sure if we were surprised, because I'm not sure we had any idea how many would attend, if I'm honest. But we felt it was too low, and I think that was a view shared by schools and local government as well, and that we should work together to try and get that number up.
And coming on then to how you did that, we know that there had, very close to the pandemic, so June 2019, there had been a report for the Department for Education that expressed concern about the systems for sharing information and said that they were not wholly reliable, that there was no consistency in how information was shared, is held, and in particular this was as between local authorities and schools. I think that report found that schools know when a child has an allocated social worker, but they may not know that a child is receiving early help or is a child in need. Did that prove to be a problem?
I think you might be referring to the Child in Need review that my team did and was published by the government in, I think, June 2019. Information sharing has long been a big focus because repeatedly, when lessons are being learned, there's usually some breakdown in information sharing. This specific axis, if you like, between schools and local authorities, we were not. No issues on that weren't escalated to us. It felt like information sharing is much more an issue between police, health, social workers and schools. And in fact, I think I said in my statement, in at least one, more than one local authority where historically the relationship between local authorities and some of the schools, academies in particular, had not been great. It felt like that, all those historic kind of tensions went out the window as they basically worked together and focused on their children.
So would it be right to say then that you weren't concerned that the problem limiting attendance numbers was in that identification? No,
we did. The extent to which they were sharing information was talked about, but it was never identified as a barrier.
Okay. Can we look, please, at INQ 000546957? This is a survey conducted for this inquiry by the Local Government Association. And if we look, please, at page 39, I wonder if this tells us something about how local authorities were going about organising themselves for this exercise. We read that only 1 in 4 councils who responded to the survey outlined their regular contact and monitoring of vulnerable children, covering reviewing vulnerable children's attendance. We read later down that page that only 1 in 5 reported individual in-depth council liaison with school heads. We read over the page, please, on page 40, that only 1 in 5 highlighted organising a central list of vulnerable children. And only 1 in 5 reviewed individual child plans and risk assessments to help them to assess what each child needed and the prioritisation of vulnerable children attending schools. Thank you, that can come down now. Ms Morris, it would seem from this that there was quite a significant degree of variation in practice amongst local authorities. What is your view about why that was the case?
I think there are two questions here. One is the variation in practice, and yes, I recognise that. And there's a perennial issue with devolved services about how much you prescribe and standardise and the approach and the relationship with DfE and schools and local government is such that it's usually done through guidance, some of it statutory, some of it not. When I first looked at that, I was a bit taken aback, and my question was why the discrepancy, the sort of 1 in 5, 1 in 4, between what we were seeing and hearing and what that says. But I went back to the original question, and it was a question about pre-March the 18th planning, and it asked those people who said they had done some pre-March 18 planning, then what they had done. So if you'd said yes, you got to ask this free text. So I think this is a useful example, but I think we risk kind of misreading. That said, I'm not sitting here and saying every council did this in a way, or that we knew every council were doing this in the most effective way. And I think I mentioned in my statement the kind of pandemic context for the relationship team with central government and local government is really vital, and that links to data and the willingness and the ability and the architecture around data collection.
Thank you. Let me just unpack that. I
Sorry.
think there was a few, not at all, I think there were a few things there. So I think you said that list of returns, and we will check again what exactly that relates to. You say that doesn't correlate with your experience. So was it your experience that actually local authorities were much more organised than that would suggest?
The examples resonate. It was the 1 in 4, 1 in 5, that low number didn't resonate. And I think if it had been that drastic an issue, given how often, we were talking, particularly through REACT, to schools and local authorities, we would have known with confidence. So that's not to say it never came up as an issue, but it wasn't a sort of, wasn't widespread.
And my question from that was going to be, if there was such a degree of variation, I accept you're saying that you don't think there was, does that suggest there needs to be more coordination from the centre? I think you're saying that's a perennial problem and it's very difficult to say.
Yeah, and we did analyse variation. So earlier we talked about the dashboard and you put up the front page. Behind that sits a RAG rating of each local authority according to the relative attendance of vulnerable children with children in need and children with the HCP and other factors. So there was variation, and that was one of the points of discussion with individual local authorities and with local authority kind of leadership organisations, if you like. So that we know there's variation. I think what's harder to know is when is variation a problem versus when is variation somebody finding just as an effective way to do what they want to do locally.
Thank you. Can we look, please, then, at INQ 000546826, which is one of the situation reports from the Vulnerable Children and Young People Unit, again from November, so quite far in. And we understand from your statement that at this stage, the data collection that you have stressed was up and running, and the data available was really quite rich and detailed. Can we look then at page 3, please? And I should say this report is very data-rich, and it is 15 pages long, and we won't go through all of it. But we can see here the nature of it, I think. We can see on the left-hand side a summary of the data, and this is data about the number of vulnerable children that were attending, or the proportion, rather. And then we can see on the right-hand side, please, a translation of what was being done and what needed to be done around that. And just noticing briefly the final bullet point, work with cross-government partners to consider lessons learned from previous tilting of government programmes. 2 points here. I think this suggests that that cross-government work that we looked at from the beginning, from April, was that was continuing all the way through, was it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as you've seen, you know, attendance is higher than we started, but it's still not where we want it to be. So I think it's fair to say that the focus was pretty relentless and uninterrupted throughout.
Thank you. And then that penultimate bullet point, explore options to work with partner organisations to understand best practice in local authorities, multi-academy trusts, settings with strong performance. We understand from your statement that a lot of that was carried out by the REACT teams, so who were phoning and having meetings with local authorities regularly, it seems, to find out what was going on in terms of attendance in their areas. From your perspective, did that work of contacting them directly to talk through those issues have a significant impact on attendance in their areas?
I think it's really hard to claim that it did. I'm not sure what, but equally, you know, having a conversation, I had some of those conversations myself about where your attendance is, you know, much lower or your attendance is higher. Why? What are you doing? Can we help? Is a really important conversation to have, and a really point of not just learning for the kind of, if you like, the national picture, but actually about, does this local authority recognise they've got a problem? Can we help? What could help? And I think that's incredibly important. I suppose I would say on best practice, this is one of the things, again, as the SRO, that I think could I have tried to create some capacity sooner to codify that best practice more and share it more widely. There was some pre-existing work focused on persistent absence pre-pandemic, but obviously this was a much wider and bigger issue.
We see there local authorities, multi-academy trusts and settings with strong performance. In your experience, was there a difference or a significant difference in approaches to attendance as between multi-academy trusts, perhaps large multi-academy trusts on the one hand, and local authority maintained schools on the other? Oh gosh,
I couldn't say. I'm sorry, yeah, so I can't help on that. It was quite hard. I mean, I think we might come to an exhibit later that gives a sense of some of the factors, but I didn't look at the local authority maintained versus academy.
Thank you. That can come down now, thank you. It's been suggested to the inquiry by one local authority that whilst that local authority was providing REACT with a great deal of information and detail about their experiences and perhaps what was and wasn't working for them, they felt that they weren't getting a great deal of detailed guidance and information from REACT. Is that something you recognise?
Yeah, I have some sympathy with that. I mean, there is a limit to what new things, I guess, REACT had to share. There was also a degree of, there was a sort of an interesting dynamic in a way with local authority, which was both sort of, you know, tell us at times, and I'm slightly being a bit crude about this, tell us what to do, but also leave us alone to get on with our job, which I sort of can sympathise with as well. So, but I think also individual local authorities, and maybe we didn't explain enough that collectively the insight from each of them was also informing how we were sort of prioritising the asks, some of which we talked about earlier, because again in my statement I said schools and local authorities cannot do this alone, even outside a pandemic, but particularly, you know, it's also about the police, it's also about health and others too.
And just taking one perhaps granular example of practice in individual areas, we know that for children who had an education, health and care plan, whether they could attend school depended on the outcome of a risk assessment by either their local authority or their school. And that for children without such a plan, but who ordinarily had special educational needs support, whether they could attend depended on whether they were categorised probably by their school as otherwise vulnerable. Was the work of the data collection for the unit able to get that sort of richness of detail to understand whether that aspect of the policy was working or not?
The attendance of EHCP children or the risk assessment. I mean, it was an interesting one, and we did actually collect some data, I think it was in June, on this, but there was quite a lively discussion about whether we should and could, partly for the reason I explained earlier, is I think local authorities were pretty cross at times with the data we were asking, although I felt it was proportionate and reasonable. And my point is twofold. One is, if we are to help local authorities and others, we need to know what's going on. And the second is, actually, it's not unreasonable to ask for transparency and assurance that the things that are, are happening actually are happening. So yeah, but it wasn't a sort of regular and routine. We also had some discussions, for example, in meetings with special schools, some of whom said their local authority delegated the risk assessment to them. So there was a bit of a sense that local authorities, sorry, I could go on. Might not be helpful.
It's been suggested that some parents didn't feel that the schools were assessing properly, or that, in fact, it's been suggested that local authorities weren't able to press or challenge schools if they felt that the assessment outcome was the wrong one for that individual child. Is that something that centrally there was any intention to provide guidance for or direct?
There was guidance on doing the risk assessment, and I think there was a good practice guidance issued as well. My apologies, I can't remember the date of that. I suppose my question would be, was that parents who wanted their child to attend but felt they weren't getting their space, or was that, did that reflect a different view about what was best for the child, I guess would be my question. Understood. Rather than the risk assessment itself.
It's also been pointed out that the Association of Directors of Children's Services gave some feedback to the Department for Education that the REACT engagement was relatively weak on issues relating to SEND. Is that something you recollect or recognise?
Yeah, I saw that, and I think, REACT was created for the pandemic in the same way that the VCU was, and it was the regional school, led by the Regional Schools Commissioner Director and his team, and then parts of my team, particularly Children's Social Care, Improvement, Innovation, were sort of, working together with it. And we recognised right at the outset there were different skills, different experiences, different cultures, and that wasn't straightforward necessarily. But I do also wonder if sometimes when my team spoke to local authorities, did they see them as REACT, or did they see them as the team that they'd known for a long time? But there is definitely pre-pandemic, if you'd asked local authorities which bit of the department they had most contact with, it would have been my bit rather than schools.
Thank you. And last question in respect of the dashboard. Yeah. We understand that the collection for the dashboard, and indeed perhaps the majority of the work of the Vulnerable Children Unit, was about safeguarding vulnerability for the most part. Was there separate monitoring of non-attendance attributable to clinical vulnerability? If you're not able to help, please do so.
I don't think so.
Thank you.
Though, can I say the VCU was very closely involved in attendance. REACT was the sort of, if you like, the conduit and the two-way conversation with schools and local authorities, but the VCU was, helping us bring together both the data and the intelligence, including from externals, from charities and parents groups and so forth, and trying to then analyse and triage and work out actually what we should do with it. Should we change course? Should we do anything new, etc.? So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Let's look then at some of the data that you had about poor attendance. If we can look, please, at INQ 000624778. Thank you. This is another situation report, this time from July 2020. Can we look, please, at page 16 of this? We understand that you had conducted a survey of some school leaders, and that this is what you learned about some of the reasons for non-attendance. I think you alluded to this earlier. Yeah. We see from the table at the bottom left that the largest reason was that the parent thinks the child may be exposed to the virus, then the parent refuses to send the child, the household is self-isolating, or the parent does not does not consider their child to be vulnerable. Just pausing there, do you recall what you made of the return of these results? Was this roughly as you had anticipated?
It was helpful, and I think this survey was done through REACT, but this was helpful in a sense of trying to get some sense, albeit from a relatively small sample size, if you like, the kind of the mix and the relative weight of different factors to help us test. Because when you're also hearing a lot of feedback, you have to also test that you're not just hearing the loudest voices. So it was a very useful kind of, almost a kind of, what does this tell us anything new? Does it change anything? What's this telling us? What are we learning from it?
And what was it telling you, can I ask? Because it seems that perhaps the first three one might attribute to the virus, to fear and anxiety about COVID-19.
Yes, and that was definitely a sense all the way through, although early 21 was interesting for different reasons. But that was a sense, and when we looked at some of the regional, I think I mentioned in my statement, when we did some of the regional analysis or local analysis of differences as well, at times, not always, but at times there did seem to be a relationship between attendance and COVID prevalence. But I think there's also something about confidence.
What do you think that is?
I think it was very striking that sort of later on, I think particularly after all schools have been sort of reopened to a wider group of children, I think there's something very powerful about seeing your peers go back to school and you're no longer part of a small sort of special group who might not feel special. I think there's something about building confidence. Everybody had been thrown into it's easy to forget, I think, the sort of fear and anxiety there was, particularly early on. So I think there was something about confidence and the passage of time. I haven't checked back what the public health messaging was at this time. And there's something also about, schools and local authorities never stopped. Nobody ever stopped trying. The progress was painfully slow, but we all just kept going. Yeah.
And we see here parents... Please.
Unable to make the journey to school, travel. One of the things that was different coming up to the return in September was some specific work on travel and transport to work. And again, one of the questions I've asked myself is, could we have done something on this? Because in our early work, it was a sort of barrier to attendance in the first period of closures. I'm not sure, to be honest, given where we were with the public health, etc., we could have done. But it was, I think things like this were really helpful when we were having, as we were at that point, thinking ahead to what are we learning, what would we do different going forward.
And some other notable ones here are parent does not consider their child to be vulnerable, and stigma associated with being a vulnerable child. And that goes back, I think, to your earlier point about the messaging. Is that fair? Yes.
And also, and we might get onto this a bit in the safeguarding, that there are some parents who choose, and this was pre-pandemic as well, not to cooperate with social services or with schools or for different reasons. Yeah.
Can we look, please, at the following page of this, page 17? This shows us what you learnt about how schools were responding to the issue of non-attendance of vulnerable children. And we see at the top phoning, texting or emailing the parent or carer, then contacting children's social care, communication via online learning, and so on. At the bottom, contacting the police. Given what you have said about confidence being important and fear and anxiety having driven some of that non-attendance, what do you make of the response of contacting the police, for example?
It could have been a very legitimate, particularly, and it may well have also been in conjunction with contacting children's social care, because obviously these are not sort of necessarily either or. So, for example, if there is genuine fear of risk of harm or safeguarding, and particularly if children's social care couldn't get access to the home, then the statutory guidance is to seek help from the police.
Thank you. So was this set of responses something that you were broadly comfortable with? It didn't give rise to any concern on your part?
No, not concern. But of course, it doesn't tell us anything about the sort of effectiveness or what was kind of appropriate. But yeah, it was a useful insight.
And were you forming a view at this stage about what was effective?
I mean, effective in its broadest term, but we couldn't draw a line that said, because this local authority in these schools are doing this, they're getting...
Yeah, it wasn't that clear.
It wasn't that clear. Though there was a sense that those who'd, and I think some of them have said this in evidence, and I mentioned in my statement, done the sort of RAG rating collectively and said, OK, this... we're very worried about this child. Therefore, face-to-face home visits is really important, and we might do it more frequently. So, yeah.
Thank you. Last document then on this subject, please, Ms. Morris. INQ 000542897. This is another situational report. This time it's from March 2020, so we've moved on considerably in time. If we can look, please, at page 11. We see, they're a little difficult to find, but they're just underneath these graphs.
Yep.
The numbers of, or the proportion of children attending then in March 2021, 44% of all children with an education, health and care plan, and 49% of children with a social worker. So very considerably up from the spring of 2020, but still not the majority.
Yeah.
And by this stage, of course, there'd been a vast amount of work done by yourselves in the Vulnerable Children's Unit, by REACT, by local authorities and by schools. We've heard from other witnesses. Why do you think, Ms. Morris, we still weren't seeing the majority attending at this stage?
This was, I think, still in the second school closure, which I think was January to something like the 8th of March 2021. And I think, for me, there is something, again, about the kind of overall pandemic and health messaging. This was a pack that was for the internal DfE governance for COVID. And actually, I think after this, there was a big upturn after about the 25th of March, where we went up to about 85% within EHCP and 83% with social workers, still too low, but significantly higher. And for me, that comes back a little bit to some of the points I touched on earlier. The wider attendance of your peers matters. Was the grip of the pandemic fear weaker? Although, interestingly, I think prevalence rates were actually higher in this period than they were in the first lockdown. But apologies if I'm remembering them right. There had been the start of kind of, greater visible action, if you like, on school safety measures and testing, and parental surveys of parents were saying that confidence was sort of going up. So it was improved, but I think, as you said, to me it showed the limits of what was almost the limits of what was possible if you closed to a wider group. Sorry, that was a bit long.
So then, perhaps the most difficult question of all, in light of what you've just said about the limits of what can be done, if we were to find ourselves on the brink of another civil emergency or another pandemic, and there was a need to identify which children were vulnerable, perhaps in those new circumstances, and to ensure that they were able to attend a place of safety. Is there anything that you think we can learn from your experience of this work to help us in those circumstances?
I think there are two things. I think one of the things we need to do is not make the mistake of only planning for a pandemic that has the same health risks. I think we also need to plan for a pandemic that may have also high risks to children. And of course, children didn't come out unscathed I I'm a bit uncertain as to what the right thing. I think the pre-planning of the scenarios is really important. I think this shows us that keeping settings open, or even perhaps settings open even if you have a hybrid in some ways of face-to-face attendance and online. You know, we've got different capabilities, different infrastructure now. We've learned a lot from the experience of the pandemic. Is there a kind of different model of engagement that allows it to be for all children, but flexing what the right kind of approach is? But I think what we can't ignore is that going into the pandemic was a problem, but it also not just increased pressures on families and children and young people, but pressures that already existed on the services to support them. So I think there has to be a serious look at the resilience of those services and the ability to, because a pandemic in a way is not the conditions in which you're going to fix them. You can mitigate them, and we saw that through collaboration, through local authorities and others sharing information, for example. But I think,
Thank you very much. My lady, it's 5 minutes to the scheduled break. I'm about to move on to a different subject.
Yes, of course. We take a break every so often for everybody's benefit. I shall return at 5 to 12.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Morris. Miss Morris, we're about to move on to the topic of safeguarding. Just before we do, can I please just clarify a point from before the break, which was that I think you said when we were looking at the figures for attendance in March 2021, that after the 25th of March, the numbers were much better than those which we had been looking at. I think you said 85% or thereabouts from the 25th of March.
Yep.
I think it's right that schools went back or were reopened to most pupils from the 8th of March. So did you mean that once almost all children were back at school, that's when the attendance rates were much better for vulnerable children?
And that's what I meant about the importance of peers and not being sort of singled out or in a small group.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll move then to the topic of safeguarding, please. We have already spoken about how important it was to the Vulnerable Children's Unit to have that cross-government perspective on issues related to safeguarding. And I want to come to ask you, please, about how well you think the risks to the child protection system were understood across government. If we can look, please, at INQ 000546827. This is a note of a deep dive into the issues relating to children's social care. And this was on the 27th of November 2020. So again, quite a long way into our period. And in fact, during the second lockdown, when we were shortly coming on to talk about another period of school closures. We see from this cast list, it's called, I think people attending from right across government. Is that right?
That's right. It was a Cabinet Office meeting.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate a lot of the names are redacted, so I'm asking you from your recollection, would that have been attended by senior civil servants from across government?
I think, though I can't be sure, that the names that are not redacted might have been... Actually, no, that's wrong, because at least one of those is not. They will have been civil servants, I think.
Thank you. And if we can look down, please, at the questions, it says Cabinet Office questions.
Yep.
And then we see, and actually these are just a few from quite a long list, questions like what are the specific impacts and key risks to the children's social care system caused by current November restrictions? Lower down, what are the key impacts of COVID on children's social care system, and what are the major risks? And if we could perhaps zoom out so we can just get a flavour of how many there were and how detailed they were. Thank you. If we can look at page 2, please. We see questions about any local authorities which may fail to deliver on their statutory requirements, capacity in the system. Question 5, how does COVID expose vulnerable children to wider harms, and so on. And for context, this is a note that accompanies a meeting at which your unit gave a presentation, I think.
Yeah.
Can we take it from this note that these issues would have been discussed in detail with those senior civil servants from across the government?
Yes, and some of these questions were questions from the outset. So, how does COVID expose vulnerable children to wider harms? This was, this was a meeting in November. We'd already had the Hidden Harms Summit in June. Very, very early on, we were saying this is not just about children that we know, but lockdown could increase harms to others. So these were familiar questions, and it was very helpful that Cabinet Office was also engaging.
And do you think that these issues were understood across government?
I think, it sort of varied. I think I got the sense at that point that the COVID task force and the Cabinet Office had probably greater kind of mix of backgrounds and probably understood it. Pre-pandemic, both the centre, and when I say Cabinet Office, I also mean Number 10, and the Treasury had been involved in us setting up the Special Educational Needs Review and the manifesto commitment around the independent review of children's social care. So there was a kind of degree of, I think, understanding about the objectives and the risks within the system. I think it probably was weaker when you got into things like special schools, more specific issues, and also weaker when you got to departments that we didn't have such a close pre-existing relationship with, so DCMS, for example.
Thank you. That can come down now. There are two groups that you particularly identify in your statement as groups of children whom you were particularly concerned about, and they are the under ones, so babies, and teenagers. Yeah. Starting with under ones, you point out in your statement that the risks to this group were well understood in the department from as early as April 2020. Can we look, please, at INQ 000267959? This is a report published by the NSPCC, and it wasn't published until May 2021, but it's reporting on the increase in the number of cases of abusive head trauma between March 2020 and April 2020. I should say specifically 23rd of March 2020 and the 23rd of April 2020. I'm not sure if you can see those on the page, perhaps on page 2. We see those increases, yes. That is Great Ormond Street reporting that increase in prevalence. Was that information coming through to you in the Department for Education that early on in the pandemic?
Not specifically, but as you say, we'd identified that this group were a particular risk. We felt they were more hidden than they would have ordinarily been. The national panel, which is the child safeguarding panel, had already started some work, which we published during the pandemic, about sudden unexpected death of an infant, which is counted separately to that when an infant has been killed or seriously harmed by their parent. So we were very worried about this group.
Thank you. That can come down. You say that information wasn't coming through to you specifically. Do you mean that Great Ormond Street statistic, or generally the information that there was an increase to be worried about?
I mean that Great Ormond Street.
I see.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't read into that there's any sort of information gap?
No. And we were definitely, this, as you said, this was, I think, May 21?
This was published May 21, yes.
There was connections with the some of the NHS data and child mortality group, for example, because there was some work in the autumn about raising awareness of the risk of seasonal increases, particularly around co-sleeping, that sort of thing. And we were talking with the NHS about the extent to which that increase came through or not, which it didn't in that autumn.
Thank you. Can we look, please, at paragraph 3.20 of your statement, which is on page 19? Yeah. Thank you very much. We see here what action was taken by the Vulnerable Children's Unit about this concern. If we look, please, at the penultimate sentence, I think, or where it starts, in addition,
Yeah.
the requirement to register births had been suspended in the initial pandemic response, and there was a risk that children were therefore not known about. An observer might think it was rather obvious that suspending the registration of births could lead to safeguarding problems for under ones, because if their births are not registered, they might not come to be known to GPs or local authorities. They might even fall out of sight of health visiting services. How was it that this came to be? How was it that this happened without anybody saying, stop, you shouldn't do that, that's going to create a safeguarding risk?
I think it brings us back to the lack of pre-planning. You know, I don't believe for a moment that anyone sat there and thought, all right, actually this is critical to safeguarding, but we're going to stop it anyway. I think there just probably wasn't that thought. It was probably about, you know, they were probably asked the questions, what are the services that we can pause given the situation we're in the first lockdown?
I think it was some months, was it around May 2020 that was reinstated?
Yes, and of course that created backlog, and it was easier, and it links to your point about health. Hospital births were easier to kind of track, and there was data sharing on that. Home births harder. My worry and my question, if we're thinking about impact on children, is are we still missing some children who were born in that period? And I don't know whether there's an answer to that now.
And just going back to your point about, I think you said, I don't think anybody stopped and thought this is a safeguarding risk, but we'll do it anyway. But that omission to think about the safeguarding implications for children, does that tell us anything about a lack of focus on children in decision making?
I think I'd hate to put that on the shoulders of the team who were thinking about birth registration specifically. I think, again, it comes back to that wider question about the lack of preparedness and thinking about this through the lens of what children are going to need during a pandemic and what will help us most with safeguarding. The same with health visitors.
Yes, that was going to be my next question. No, not at all. You've anticipated. The final sentence in this paragraph is the risk was compounded by health visitors not attending as they had been redeployed to the COVID-19 response roles. I think there are two questions there, which is, again, how were the safeguarding implications of that, which one might think were quite obvious, missed? And secondly, perhaps, as you say, that's compounding, that's two safeguarding risks. How could it be that was missed?
I think there are two things going on. One is there was a sense of all hands to the COVID challenge in the health system that was under enormous pressure at that time. And the second is it was patchy. I'm not convinced that that redeployment happened everywhere, but we didn't really know. But we felt that we had to work on the basis that it was a known risk that we should seek to either reverse or prevent in the future. And in fact, the prevention in the future became the biggest focus.
That point about all hands to the COVID pump, I think you say part of the answer to this is planning. But you also pointed out earlier on in your evidence that we don't know what sort of pandemic we would be preparing for.
Yeah.
Is there something structural about ensuring that children are not missed in the all hands to the pandemic pump moment?
I think there's quite a tendency in departments, you know, and I've been part of that, to have a sector or a sort of service lens on. So, you know, the focus before the pandemic was review of the SEN system or reform of children's social care. I think we need to find a way of also having the lens that starts with the child and their families, and thinks about what are the needs, what are the drivers of vulnerability, what does that mean in terms of protective public services, because I think that helps you follow the trail, if you like, through to decisions about which are the services that you need to try and protect, and if you can't, what the risks are that you need to be prepared to mitigate, or the recovery plan for when things ease.
And when you say some way of having a lens. I'm sorry to press you, but do you have an idea of what that lens would be? Some suggest, for instance, it should be incorporation of the UNCRC. Perhaps there's some other mechanism. Do you have a sense, based on your work, of what's needed?
I think that, in a way, is talking about very important potential protections. But actually, for me, it's much more about how do you approach understanding the needs of children and young people. Do we really understand that yet, even now, the impact of COVID on children and young people? We sort of understand it a bit in elements, but actually as a kind of thinking about children through different stages in their lives and how they interact with services, what they need, the conditions in which they thrive. It's it's a different way in to some of the similar questions and saying, how can we strengthen children's social care, for example, which is really important because those are protective services for children, some of our most vulnerable children. But I don't think that, I think if it comes back to the risk that you have a slightly siloed lens. Sorry, I'm not articulating this very well, but I think for me, a service lens and a sector lens only gets you so far.
Thank you. If we can look then at paragraph 3.21, we'll see what you did to address that situation. We read that you had a virtual team established across DfE, Department for Health and Social Care, and the Home Office to focus on this group, and you're talking here about babies. You say you also worked with the Chief Nurse at Public Health England, and that the Chief Nurse was also a member of the Vulnerable Children and Young People National Board. It sounds as though that particular mechanism of bringing together individuals addressed this particular problem. Is that right?
Yes, and I think also it helped that both the Home Office Minister and Minister for Children and Families were also very alive to this risk early on. And I can't speak highly enough about the Chief Nurse because sometimes engaging with health can be complicated. And of course, this was a particularly difficult time, and she really invested time in understanding and almost translating vulnerability into sort of health settings and helping us use her office, if you like, to get the message out that health visitors shouldn't be deployed coming into the next winter.
Thank you. The second group that you highlighted in your statement then are teenagers.
Yeah.
If we can look, please, at paragraph 3.22. We read here a little bit about what the interventions were or what the support was from. We worked closely with the Home Office and police, and for this reason involved VRUs. What are VRUs?
Violence reduction units who are based in local areas.
Thank you. And we read that the Home Office and the DfE ministers also wrote to police and crime commissioners. I can't quite tell, Ms Morris, what the interventions were arising from that. What was it that your unit was asking these organisations to do?
Well, partly we were concerned. We spoke to the very early conversation with the Chief Constable who led on these issues for the National Police Council. And we were worried about teenagers, the risk that teenagers would be criminalised if they if they didn't adhere to social distancing as much, and we were really keen to avoid that. We were also, and on one of the early exhibits you showed, where we talked about the narrow measure of vulnerability, there was a missing box, and we were also, because they led on that, concerned to get their help with data on missing, which was often teenagers and often a sign that there was a safeguarding risk that could be missing from care, could be missing from children's homes. And also there was a question and a conversation with DCMS about what, if anything, in their youth remit they were planning to do or wanted to do, particularly in this group, and also the conversation again with the Home Office and the police was what were they seeing in terms of emerging risks, particularly around gangs, county lines, criminal exploitation, where this group was also more vulnerable.
So is it fair to say then this is about gathering information, asking police not to fine or criminalise young people breaching regulations about COVID, and I think you said gathering information about children who are missing. Yeah. Is it fair to say those are, to some extent, quite limited interventions that practically could have prevented teenagers from, for example, online harms and criminal exploitation?
Yeah, I mean, they were very, very early on. They were almost kind of immediate in the first few weeks. And the assessment was that criminal exploitation and gangs activity had reduced, though the police weren't complacent about that. We had a meeting, the national board I chaired, which was cross-department and also stakeholders, met in, I think it was July,
Yes.
to have and we had a dedicated item on teenagers, and that invited the Children's Commissioner to present her work and the Association of Colleges who lead on further education to share with us and other stakeholders what was happening and what might help. But I think I've made no secret of the fact that it feels that, we did a certain amount, but I question whether we could have done more.
Yes.
But again, it sort of brings me back to that. There is not a strong cohort lens, probably with the exception perhaps of care leavers. There wasn't really a sort of teenage or adolescent agenda going into the pandemic, and we were able to focus on the really high-risk elements of it, but I don't think we really quite galvanised beyond that.
Yes, you say in your statement at paragraph 3.2, we're at 3.22, I beg your pardon. I think it might be 3.26, please. Yes, you say it is impossible to fully know the extent of risks facing vulnerable children, and it makes dealing with them more challenging, and I do not think we have a full picture to this day. You also comment on the challenge you had in securing support for teenagers. It appears, Ms. Morris, that you expressed some disappointment in the extent to which you're able to support teenagers. Is that fair?
Yes, I mean, it's a difficult one because you can't always do everything that you want to do, but I felt that this was something that I regretted on a personal level. And I think when you look now at, so we touched earlier on the serious incident notifications, or I mentioned it in my statement, it's very striking that if you look at the data now, teenagers, are now kind of the second highest group. So for me, there is a sort of an unmet need that I don't think we really got to grips with.
So, sorry, the second highest group in what regard?
Sorry, in respect of the number of serious incident
I see.
notifications, the age group has gone up for the second highest. It's under ones remains the largest.
Thank you. The third and final limb of the original work structure then that we looked at was recovery. And you discuss in your statement mental health provision.
Yeah.
I entirely appreciate, Ms. Morris, that you have now left the civil service, so you may be unable to comment on this, and please do say so if that's the case. Do you have an opinion as to what extent there is an enduring impact that perhaps recovery measures haven't been able to address?
I mean, the sort of publicly available evidence suggests that there is, but again, the work on it has been quite fragmented, and I thought actually the expert report that you had to the inquiry probably knitted it together better than most things, but that might also be that I haven't been sort of following this closely. I think the question we haven't answered, and that's applies to mental health, but also more broadly, is this a COVID generation, or is this now something that is, if you like, kind of embedded and part of kind of, and I think that's quite important for thinking about what the response is. And also, serious incident notifications. I know these are a small number, but they're the most acute. Again, it's striking that suicide has gone up as a cause of death, if you look at the current data for 23-24, and the increase in deprivation of liberty orders as well, again, which was a problem and a challenge going up. So there's a sense for me that there is a problem at the most acute end. That provision is not set up, whether that's in the NHS or in the care system, to support.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morris. I want to come to now ask you about your overall reflections for the future. And you have kindly answered some of those questions as we have gone along. But if I can ask you, please, to look at paragraph 6.3 of your statement at page 27. You say here that we need to put the child and young person at the heart of planning, delivery and learning. There should be a proper focus on allowing the voices of children and young people themselves to be heard and to inform any measures taken. And I want, if I may, Ms Morris, to just press you slightly on that again. In terms of concrete mechanisms that one could put in place by way of pandemic planning, do you have a view on that, how that could be achieved?
I mean, I think from an SRO perspective, I could have say, worked with the National Children's Bureau, early on said, let's set up a Children and Young People's Board. You know, they have experience of running those kind of things to help inform us and have that voice more directly, not just filtered, if you like, or advocated through the charities. The fact that we couldn't even get a pre-return to school press conference in September, if I'm honest, still makes me quite cross. But I still think, you know, actually, could we have done a bit more, and that wouldn't have necessarily needed to go through the Cabinet Office sort of decision making.
Thank you. Another point that I wanted to ask you about is at paragraph 6.7 over at page 28.
Yeah.
Here you say we need to guard against optimism bias. You say, I think we were overly optimistic about how quickly the pandemic would end and normality return. How might we guard against optimism bias in the future?
I mean, there is something about planning. You know, your scenarios work on a number of different levels, wouldn't they, including duration. But I think it's also about just thinking about creating the space to call it out and check ourselves against it. And I think we did later on. I think we got better at that. But I think in those early weeks and couple of months, there was a sort of, maybe it was a bit of a hope that, you know, it really would be 12 weeks, you know, hard focus, and then we'd be through it. But I think there's a over optimism is a factor that we've seen in a number of different kind of play out in a number of different forums, I think.
Thank you, Ms Morris. Those are the questions that I have about your recommendations. Is there anything that you want to add to them?
I mean, I think, yeah.
Take your time. Try having a sip of water.
Thank you. That's very good advice. I think my gratitude to everyone.
Thank you, Ms Morris.
Ms Morris, can I go back to, you said you couldn't get a pre-return to school press conference. Who blocked that? Was that Communications Department, Downing Street, Cabinet Office?
I talked to the DfE comms lead, who felt that we got an agreement from Number 10, and then it didn't happen. So, but it was an ask of them, and this was also coming from the Children's Commissioner, who was saying it would be great to have a Downing Street press conference. Let's get the message out to children. Yeah.
But no explanation as to why it didn't happen.
No.
Ms Morris, thank you very much indeed for coming to help the inquiry. You've been extraordinarily frank and really helpful, and I'm very grateful to you. I appreciate it. It's not easy, and I could see at the end, you know, it takes you over, and I know it's not easy to go back over those very difficult times. So thank you for all you tried to do. Thank you for your honesty, and thank you for helping us.
Thank you.
Thank you. My lady, the next witness is Professor Sam Barron.
Thank you.
My lady, may I call Professor Sam Barron?
I do solemnly.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence that I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Hope we haven't kept you waiting for too long, Professor Barron.
No, that's fine, thank you.
My lady, I should say at the outset that this evidence session may be distressing in that it will refer to children who died as a result of neglect and abuse during the pandemic.
Thank you.
Professor Barron, you have provided a witness statement for the inquiry. I think you have it in front of you, and our reference for it is INQ 000588188. You signed that witness statement on the 24th of September 2025. Can you confirm that its contents are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can, yes.
Thank you. And Professor Barron, you are giving evidence today in your capacity as the Interim Chief Executive Officer of the British Association of Social Workers, or BASWA as we'll call it. And you took on that role fairly recently on the 15th of September, is that right?
I did, yes.
Thank you. Your predecessor in that role was Dr. Ruth Allen, and she had also provided a witness statement for this module on behalf of BASWA, and it was dated the 21st of July 2025. I understand that you have had the opportunity to read that witness statement carefully, and that on behalf of BASWA you agree with its contents and wish to adopt it as your own evidence. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And for the transcript, the reference for that statement is INQ 000650824. That is the statement that we will be mainly referring to during the course of your evidence, and for ease, I'll refer to it as BASWA's statement.
Thank you.
Professor Barron, Dr. Allen had previously given evidence to this inquiry about adult social care in the context of an earlier module, and that evidence included something of an introduction to the role of BASWA, so I don't need to ask you to tell us about that. But in terms of children and family social workers, I understand that at the time of the pandemic, of BASWA's 22,000 members, it was estimated that about 60% of those worked in children and family services. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And in terms of geographical reach, BASWA represents social workers across the whole of the UK, is that right?
We do.
Thank you. And whilst social care is a devolved competence, is it right that there's a degree of commonality in the statutory duties of social workers who work with children and families across the UK?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And a point made in BASWA's statement is that the social workers that BASWA represents deliver their statutory responsibilities through a range of roles, and that whilst many are employed by local authorities, others might be employed by different agencies, such as foster care agencies, or different public services like the Children and Family Court Advisory Support Services. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Professor, we have heard evidence already in these hearings about the fact that one of the consequences of school closures and of lockdown was that many children were living with a heightened degree of risk and harm and facing greater adversity in their own homes. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Thank you. We have heard, however, that during the first part of lockdown in spring 2020, there was a significant decrease in the number of referrals to children's services. And I think you'll have seen evidence of that across the UK. So, for example, the Northern Ireland Department for Health has told the inquiry that the average number of child protection referrals in the first 3 weeks of April was 34% lower than in 2019. There is evidence that in Wales, the Welsh Government reported reduced referrals. The Department for Education has provided evidence that referrals were 16% lower. And we know that similarly in Scotland, there were trends of lower referrals, including to CAMHS. From BASWA's perspective, was concern about the fact that heightened risk to children was seemingly not reflected in rates of referrals a concern across the UK?
Yes, it was definitely a concern across the UK, and our members were reporting ahead of any statistical monitoring that actually we were concerned about referral rates declining, that actually the numbers that were coming through, the partner agencies who would normally refer into social services weren't referring into social services, and we also knew from our members that there'd be a level of unmet need, particularly around children and families who'd previously...
Just going to ask you, Professor, to slow down
Sorry,
a little.
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Please carry on. You were saying unmet need.
Yeah, our members were reporting that they've also had concerns around unmet need. And unmet need refers to those children and families who previously never had any contact with social services. We knew that actually the pandemic would affect pre-existing issues for families and children. So there was a level of concern that really initially wasn't being picked up.
Thank you. And one of the key points I think that BASWA makes clear in its witness statement is that for social workers, they needed, on the one hand, to continue to fulfil their legal duties and obligations and what they felt were their ethical obligations, with, on the other hand, wanting to stay safe and avoid spreading the virus or becoming ill themselves. And taking just a practical example, a social worker whose daily work might involve visiting 4 different families might be worried about spreading the virus by going home to home, but also the interests of the children who they were planning to visit in doing so if they weren't going to go to the home. Is that right? Was that sort of the central tension for social workers?
Yes, it was an initial attention around the absence of PPE for social workers and how they undertake home visits. So there was no clear guidance and no understanding of how social workers predominantly in children's services work in family homes and what impact that would have. There was much more focus on health. BASWA actually did 6 representations across government asking for more direct guidance around the use of PPE, and to my knowledge, since coming into post, we never received a reply to that. We were instead dependent on public health guidance, which was directed to health professionals working in community settings.
And just pausing there so we understand, what specifically was missing from public health guidance directed to social workers in community settings? What was the difficulty in interpreting and applying that for going to visit children in their homes?
All right, so the first thing was about the level of PPE and the absence of PPE for social workers. We were definitely not a priority area. The second one was about transmission of the virus and actually having the right PPE in between home visits and how that would affect the social worker, the parents and the children.
I see, and in fact BASWA produced its own guidance about these issues, didn't it?
It did, yes.
And I think BASWA also produced guidance about how a social worker should decide whether or not it was safe to carry out a home visit. Is that right?
It did, yeah.
And Professor Barron, that judgment of knowing whether or not to make a home visit, of knowing whether or not to enter a home, that must be a particularly difficult judgment for an individual social worker, is it?
It is. It's an enormously complex thing without a pandemic. If you then place the restrictions of the pandemic on about and restrictions around visiting, being in close proximity and social distancing, that became even more complex. There is, in some of the evidence submitted by Professor Harry Ferguson, a really good example of some of the tensions and the ethical considerations a social worker has to consider, and it involves a social worker going out on a home visit, only being allowed to do a doorstep visit, with a parent alleging that they had coronavirus and therefore would not be able to go into the family home, whilst also seeing a very small child under the age of 5 at the top of the stairs with a black eye. Now,
again, I'm just going to ask you to slow down.
Yeah,
Thank
sorry.
you, Professor. Not at all. Thank you.
So that situation itself would demand social work skills in terms of being able to assess information very quickly, maintain some kind of rapport with the adult, understand whether actually the adult did have coronavirus and was it appropriate to seek medical confirmation of that, whilst also engaging with a child who was some distance away, which actually the social worker managed to do very effectively, and actually the child came to the door so the social worker could do a more accurate assessment. But in that moment, the social worker, not only in terms of deploying their own skills to engage and gather information, would have been balancing coronavirus restrictions and not to go into the house, actually with his or her statutory requirements around the protection and the assessment of risk for that child, in addition to balancing the social worker's own needs around transmission and the potential to get coronavirus.
And in that moment, and in all of those difficult things that the social worker has in their mind, is it the case that a very good piece of guidance could have helped that social worker, or is there a reality that that is such a difficult judgment that it would be very difficult to produce a piece of guidance that could guide somebody through that situation?
Yeah, I think it is complex, but the difficulty is you were responding to guidance and legislation. So I think for a future pandemic, that would be the issue that you'd want to balance really and have a clearer direction, because guidance is guidance, but you have a statutory responsibility. If there'd have been better measures put in place to support the social worker in that, actually the social worker may have actually wanted to go into the house to actually then do an assessment with the child and with the family to be a bit more accurate. I think the other bit about guidance would be just to reinforce the multidisciplinary nature of the assessment of children and families, because that was very absent. So in that moment, the social worker was also left with that information on their own.
Thank you. That example is very clear and very helpful. And in your statement, you set out a number of ways that the child protection system came under pressure as a result of the pandemic. And you described, just as you have a moment ago, how some of those pressures created system-wide problems that impacted on children. And I want to explore with you how some of those problems manifested in practice on the ground. We are able to gain some insight into that through the Safeguarding Practice Review that was conducted following the death of Finlay Bowden. Before I ask you questions about this, I should stress that this inquiry is considering the systemic impact of the pandemic, and that it is not this inquiry's function to consider the circumstances of an individual death, but that these questions are asked to help us have a better understanding of the practical reality and the gravity of the points that you make in your statement about those systemic issues. When the pandemic arrived in early March 2020, Finlay Bowden was a newborn who was in the legal care of a local authority, and his case was being considered by the family courts as part of care proceedings. And the question for the social workers and the courts was whether this baby should live with his parents, who were known to have histories of substance abuse and domestic violence in previous relationships, and to have been unable to cope with caring for this child's older sibling. The Safeguarding Practice Review into the circumstances of his death later found that as a result of this legal status, this child should have been one of the most protected children, because social services were working so intensely with him and his family. The pandemic, however, had brought additional challenges that the child protection system perhaps hadn't faced before, and I want to talk through some of those with you, please. First of all, although this child's family were going through court proceedings, which meant that an experienced social worker was appointed to be his independent guardian and to represent his interests, and that guardian, together with lawyers and magistrates, were involved in reviewing his safety. Because of the pandemic, those court proceedings became remote, and in this case, they were largely conducted by telephone. The Safeguarding Practice Review found that that inhibited some of the discussions between those professionals that would normally happen at court, and that led to some confusion during those proceedings. For example, the child's guardian thought that there had been an order for drug testing of the parents before they could take their baby home, whereas in fact there hadn't been such an order. And in Baswa's statement, Professor Barron, Bas will point out that the vast majority of care cases became remote hearings rather than in-person hearings during the pandemic, and that sometimes did lead to confusion and delay. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Is that something that Basworth social workers were worried about?
Yes, they were worried about that. Just before I comment on that bit further, if I can just express some condolences about the death of a child, but also some sincere thanks actually to the grandparents who stepped in to look after and protect this child and his sister. So sorry, could you repeat that question again?
Was the move from in-person court hearings to remote hearings something that Basworth social workers were worried about?
Yeah, they were worried about that largely because when you're in person, what you're actually doing in those situations is gathering information and trying to piece together a very high-risk jigsaw. And you do that as part of a multi-professional team. And that is then relayed through a court process. When you're actually online, it restricts that. It restricts the sharing of information because it comes, online conversations become much more task-orientated rather than exploratory. And that was definitely a contributory factor in this.
Thank you. Returning to this case, there was a period when the child's local authority social worker was on leave for 6 weeks because of illness, during which no visits were conducted to the child and no child in need meetings were held. The local authority in question partly attributed this to the unique pressures of the pandemic, but in fact, in Basworth's statement, you have highlighted the issue of reduced workforce and spikes in staff sickness as something that inevitably impacted the capacity to safeguard and support the child, despite the best efforts of many practitioners. Is it your view then that this was probably quite a widespread problem during the pandemic?
What was a widespread problem?
Staff illness, staff shortages leading to children not being seen.
Yes, I mean, to some degree, which is an awful term to use in this context, it was a perfect storm, which was a long time in the making, which is around workforce pressures for children, people working in children and families. So what you had in this particular instance, you had 3 social workers, which is unusual in itself. The social worker who knew the family the best actually went off on a period of sick leave. We don't know if that was coronavirus linked or not. You then had an NQSW, a newly qualified social worker who was working on the case. That would be somebody who's in their first year of practice. To be in your first year of practice with such a complex case, when you are becoming a practitioner and meeting your colleagues online, so you do not have opportunities for the professional socialisation process that you'd normally get by being in an office, contributed quite significantly. The other social worker was an agency social worker, and again that reflects the use of agency social workers because of retention issues around children and families. Agency workers largely are very experienced social workers, but they're coming into a new local authority, a new employer, a new context. And if I'm writing how I've read the case, actually that it was the agency social worker who didn't have experience in working in children and families.
And those are the details of this case, but does that tell us something about how complex staff shortages can become when the staff in question are highly specialist children's social workers?
Absolutely, yes, it tells you that. It also really gives a recommendation towards having child protection as named workers so that you don't have as many workers, so you can keep that consistency of information and assessment.
We also know that from the safeguarding review that one of the new social workers who stepped in went on to produce what the report called an over-optimistic assessment of these parents' ability to care for their child, and that because of the pandemic, that social worker's observations of the dynamic between the child and his parents had been based on outdoor contact sessions. Would you agree that, again, at a systemic level, requirements for social distancing and different ways of practice might have resulted in assessments might have resulted in social workers' ability to observe normal interactions being impaired?
Yes, they were significantly impaired because actually an assessment of children and family actually predominantly takes place within the place where children live, and there you're able to observe relationships with adults who lives in the home, the material conditions of the home, whether there's extreme levels of poverty. So to undertake a visit from a doorstep or in fact on occasion in a garden actually limits your understanding to bring that information together. but also at that point, so did multidisciplinary working. So you know, and that social worker that you've quoted, you know, it appears that she or he took substantial information from what was being presented to her from the parents. Now, what we know, we would normally gather information from schools, teachers, health visitors, who were all actually not working in the way that we
And pausing there, because you're right to pick up that point. We also know from the review that this child's father had recently been released from prison, which meant that probation services should have been regularly monitoring him. But because of the pandemic, probation offices were closed and his remaining monitoring sessions took place by telephone. Similarly, that the father was known to have used a range of Class A, B and C drugs in the past, but that the substance abuse services he was engaging with also switched from in-person to remote services, and he was relied upon to self-report his drug use. Is that an example of the multi-agency or perhaps multi-services system not functioning as it usually would?
It's completely a very good example. I think also in the example in the case report, there was actually housing identified as well, and they would be quite a key partner.
And we also know from this review that when the child was placed back in his family's care, there were 3 occasions on which he could have been seen in the home. On one occasion, in the later months of 2020, so during the second national lockdown, a health visitor who had identified this family as high priority and thus meriting an in-person visit wasn't able to see the child because the child's mother said that he was having a COVID test. And soon thereafter, the social worker who was supposed to carry out an unannounced visit wasn't able to do so again because the child's mother said that he had COVID and it had never been confirmed whether or not there had been a test and that the test had been positive. And not long thereafter, the police also attended the home, but it isn't clear from the report whether the police entered the home, and it is clear that they didn't know to check on the children. And this meant, didn't it, that in the weeks prior to this child's death, he wasn't seen by any of the professionals who in ordinary times would have been inside his home. And I think this problem of professionals not being able to get into homes during lockdown, and even, as you say, being faced by families who say or who use COVID as an excuse, is one that BASWA was worried about at the time. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I think also it's also about actually can we request medical evidence of that somebody has COVID, and that was a debate amongst our members about whether it would be ethical to do that.
Why was that a matter for debate?
Well, it's a debate in the sense that, you know, if we've got some issues around disguise compliance, we are concerned about the risks, and parents or adults are using COVID as an excuse to actually not allow participation. Would it have been right then to seek a medical diagnosis of that?
Were you aware of any guidance on that issue?
There was no guidance.
Can we look, please, at INQ 000588022? This is the record of the Every Story Matters project for this module, and we see here a quote from a social worker in Northern Ireland also expressing this concern. Do you have any sense, Professor, and please say if you don't, of how widespread an issue this was?
I think around children and families where they were working with children at risk in the child protection, that would have been a very high priority.
Thank you. 2 other points in respect of the safeguarding practice review into the death of Finlay Bowden. We also know that there should have been extensive discussion about all of these circumstances between junior social workers who were handling the case, and as you've said, who may have been new to the case or to the local authority, and their supervisors. But of course, because of the pandemic, that usual pattern of discussion and supervision was interrupted by the fact that everybody was working from home. Is that something that BASWA was worried about at the time?
Yeah, definitely. Our members were definitely reporting that in terms of getting supervision, because supervision around practice happens in 2 different ways. It will happen informally, and informally is literally when you are in the office and you will seek the advice and guidance of somebody more experienced, whether that's a social worker or your line manager. We also know, because of the increased workload and the move towards home working and having to actually introduce computers, data protection to that, that actually supervision was less frequent for managers. And obviously in this case, actually you had some inexperienced social workers who were newly qualified, where supervision would be required to happen so many times a month.
And why is supervision so important for social workers?
Well, supervision is a way of supporting and making sure the right decisions are made around children at risk. It's a way of exploring information so that we can jointly share that decision. It's a way of developing professionals to understand the information and where their professional legal responsibilities sit.
And another difference in practice at the time, in this case, is that there should have been child protection conferences or child in need meetings regularly, where professionals would discuss the case with each other, but also on occasions with the child's parents. But because of the pandemic, those meetings became remote, and the parents joined either by telephone or not at all. And it isn't always, we read from the safeguarding review that it wasn't always clear whether the parents or the family had been seen. Would it be fair to say that this issue of reduced opportunity to speak to families in person was also widespread during the pandemic?
Yes, and it very significantly affects your ability to collate information. I think we've used in our submission the word curation, and then actually if you're doing something online, then parents who harm children can curate. Now, people curate for lots of different reasons. They curate information through shame, through guilt, through protection, not wanting to reveal somebody's in the home, but they will also curate as to defend against some of the actions that they've done against children.
Thank you. And we know, Professor, that very sadly this little boy died, aged 10 months old, on Christmas Day of 2020. And we won't go into the detail of how he died, but the judge who sentenced his parents for his murder said that he had suffered from unimaginable cruelty. And if we can please look now at the one of the conclusions of the Safeguarding Practice Review at INQ, thank you, 000581928, paragraph 2.41, we see that one of the conclusions was that at what was a crucial point in planning for the children, the myriad protective systems and services designed to detect, prevent, and respond to maltreatment were severely disrupted. As a consequence, face-to-face contact with families reduced or ceased, professionals' dependence on parents' self-reporting correspondingly increased. Taking a step back then, Professor, from a social work perspective, do you consider that this tells us something important, perhaps, about how our child protection systems were undermined during the pandemic?
Yes, I think it does tell you how they were undermined, and because we were relying on self-reporting, often and obviously in this case, to the exclusion of other professionals having access to provide that wider information. But usually, outside of pandemics, that multi-professional system works very well, and it works well to actually provide lots of information, often which can be competing information, which we then have to balance and consider risks and then decide what we would need to do to protect a child.
Thank you. That can come down now. Now, that is, of course, one safeguarding review, but we know that local child safeguarding practice reviews are reviewed annually by the Child Safeguarding Review Panel. And I think you have had a chance to consider the annual review that was published in 2021 about the reviews that were collected in 2020. We don't need to go there, but I think you will have seen that the reported number of serious incident notifications were 27% higher for 2020 than they had been for 2019. And those are reports of serious injuries or deaths for children who had been looked after. At first blush, that might appear to tell us that the pandemic was causing a very significant increase in the numbers of children known to local authorities who were being significantly harmed. Would that be a correct conclusion?
Yes, that would be a correct conclusion. And I don't think Basworth submitted evidence specific to serious incidents and the data around that. But what we did say in our evidence was actually that we were very confident that those pre-existing factors would increase with referrals and then also increase serious incidents.
So is it your view then that was a predictable
Yes.
increase? We've also heard evidence from a director of children's services that in her view, it was becoming clear late on in the pandemic that the caseloads that her department were working with had increased in complexity. And I think you will also have seen Department for Education evidence from 2022 that several local authorities were saying the same thing. Is that an experience that BASWA members had as well?
Yes, completely. You know, we were aware as social workers that if we were moving into a position of the pandemic where the restrictions on people's movement and restrictions on what people could do, it was also meant that there would be additional pressures in the home, and those pressures would be resulting from poverty, they'd be resulting from people not being in employment. It would also be, if there are any pre-existing issues, for example, mental ill health, any substance use, addiction, any domestic violence, that would increase significantly.
Thank you, Dr. Barron. Professor
Okay.
Barron, sorry. I'm going to come now to ask you about some of the changes that were made across the UK through regulations and guidance. And we know that a suite of regulations were made as part of the earliest responses to the pandemic in the child protection sector. And I know that BASWA was critical of many of those changes. Before I ask you about those, though, I want to ask you, just reflecting on the discussion we've just had about one case, whether there was any changes that weren't made to practice that you thought perhaps ought to have been, or any guidance that wasn't forthcoming that perhaps ought to have been. So, for example, we talked about supervision and about how that moved to be online or became less frequent. Is that the sort of thing that there ought to have been some guidance or thinking about?
Yes, I mean, I think that's a good example of what we could have thought about. I think there should have been more attention paid to home visits. You can't escape the fact that you need to do an assessment of a child's environment, and I think further guidance around how we undertake home visits, and to have used BASWA to actually explore that and work that through in terms of what we could have done in a different way. So when you compare it to health, actually, significant changes were made across the health system to promote people still getting a health service, but actually it was restrictions in social work and social care. So there was a complete undermining, really, of the public welfare system that protects children and families in that situation. So I think it could have done that. The easements that they brought in, I think the profession was shocked that actually they were brought in, quite surprised by the extent of them, that here we were in a pandemic and actually the removal of a child's rights, which in essence what the easements represented, creates considerable difficulties for children, families and for social workers.
Just thinking back to the comment you made about more attention needing to be paid to home visits. You have commented already that there ought to have been more PPE and perhaps sufficient PPE for a change between visiting different homes. Other than that, is there anything that could have helped to decide when and how to conduct home visits?
Yeah, I think there could have been exploration about whether you could have visited more than one person with another professional, what that visit looked like. I think you could have asked families to actually meet in other places, and actually you observe families working together and working with children, so you can observe that. So I think there are two different things you could have done in that respect, and to have explored that a bit further.
So more creativity, different options.
Yes.
Coming then to the regulations themselves, we know from the witness statement of the Trades Union Council that Unison campaigned for the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment Regulations to be scrapped. And one of the issues they raised is that there had been no consultation with social workers.
That's correct.
And was that your experience as well?
That is correct, yeah.
And BASWA's witness statement explains that the reason that BASWA was opposed to the easements in the Care Act, BASWA's witness statement explains the reasons for your opposition to the easements, as they were called, in the Care Act and the regulations. And if we can look, please, at paragraph 125 of the BASWA witness statement, that's page 28. we see that a particular concern related to the use of the phrase "as soon as is reasonably practicable" in relation to conducting reviews of care arrangements. Why was that a particular concern?
Because it removes a timed right for a child. So how this is phrased is that, children who are looked after by the local authority, there was an inherent assumption in the guidance that actually because children were looked after, they therefore were in a safe, protected place, and therefore you could ease their legal right to have a timed assessment, when actually a social worker would do that quite the opposite way around, which is a child that has been removed is significantly at risk and has faced considerable risk, and therefore the need for timed assessment and the timing of an assessment and the timeness of a review is to protect the child. Children have the right to grow, they have the right to develop, they have the right to maintain contact with their families, and actually without that assessment you can't then enable those functions to happen.
Thank you. As part of these regulations also, local authorities were permitted to have social workers visiting children living in institutional settings less frequently than they're ordinarily required to, and that those visits were permitted to be undertaken remotely. Can you explain, please, what the particular limitations of remote visits in institutional settings would be?
Yeah, well, again, it's about the child's rights to have an assessment, actually. And, we would hope that children that are looked after are there for a period of time and that actually they can move forward in their lives. If you don't have an assessment of a child, whether they're at home, whether they're in the foster carers, whether they're in an institutionalised setting, you don't allow that progress of that child. And that will be for people, for example, children leaving care. So children might be leaving an institutionalised care setting and moving into semi-independent. If you suspend or defer an assessment and a review period, then that process will not happen, which ultimately can create terrible anxiety and increased trauma for that child.
It may be said, Professor Barron, that maintaining the frequency of visits to children in these range of settings was or would have been overly burdensome for local authorities and social workers, and that it was necessary for there to be a reduction. What would you say to that?
I think I go back to the earlier point that children who are looked after children are actually more high risk with high level needs, and actually to suspend their right to protect their needs is quite a serious position to be in.
Thank you. Can we look also at another change, which was the ability or the provision for some children who were in care to have their contact with their birth families take place remotely rather than in person? Can we look, please, at paragraph 142 of your witness statement, which is at page 32? Thank you. We read there that Basil was concerned about this being a consequence of delays in court proceedings. And at 143, we read an example of one social worker explaining that they had a child aged 3 who said to them, "Mummy lives in a computer now," because she saw her mum only through virtual contact. That is a very sad thing to read and contemplate, Professor. But again, thinking through what might be a difficult balance, it's right to say, isn't it, that for many children who are in care, the contact that they have with their parents is supervised for that child's safety. And that supervision is often facilitated by paid professionals at a dedicated venue. So that's lots of people coming into contact, potentially in a confined space. It may be said that it was understandable in those circumstances or necessary to reduce transmission of the virus to move that contact online. Again, that's a difficult balance. Where do you say that balance lies, Professor?
That's a difficult question to know where that balance sits. The most important thing is how we maintain contact with birth families, actually. And in this case, obviously, the little boy was 3 years of age. So it's about our relationships with primary caregivers and what that means to a child's emotional and physical development. And that was severely hampered through going online, combined with court delays, actually you hamper that relationship. Now, what we don't know in this situation was what the court outcome would be. And actually, children who have gone through court proceedings have varying levels of contact with their families, and it's dependent on the child, depends on the families and where they are, but also the age of the child. And actually, the primary thing here is about the child's emotional development, and actually to have delays and restrictions that then actually seriously affects that relationship.
So would it be your position, Professor, that the child's emotional need and the child's right to see their parent in person should have taken priority over the risk of transmission of the virus?
I think mitigation could have been put in place around transmission of the virus.
What sort of mitigation?
Well, testing.
Testing.
We could quite simply find out if those people were tested rather than to have a blanket approach, which is to go online.
So let me understand your position then. It would be that there should have been greater focus on whether it was possible in an individual case to use things such as testing, rather than have the general rule that all contact would move online.
Yeah.
One more difficult question about balance, please, if I may. We know that another change in the delivery of children's social care is that some of the support services that social services usually provide became more scarce. And we know that, for instance, the availability of short break or respite services significantly reduced. I don't think I need to take you there, but the Local Government Association survey for this inquiry showed that 55% of English local authorities and 68% of Welsh local authorities decreased the availability of short break or respite services. Those are services that usually enable people for caring. Those are services that usually enable people who are caring for children with very challenging needs to share some of that care and essentially to have a break. Again, that is a situation that requires people to move around from home to home and therefore may well have risked transmission of the virus. On the other hand, withdrawing those services could be very difficult indeed for those children and their carers. Where does the balance lie in that respect?
Where's the balance lie? The balance lies in the protection of the child, really, and because the protection of the child is primacy. So how do we then become creative or innovative, particularly through the use of testing, to make sure that those services are maintained to some degree for children that we know that would be at exceptionally high risk?
I think that there was a time, Professor, during the pandemic when testing wasn't widely available. Would it be your view that in circumstances like that, actually sometimes we do have to curb, for want of a better word, the child's right to respite or to contact, for example? Or is it your view that the child's rights should take primacy over those concerns?
I think I mentioned child's rights in relation to risk. So I think some of the guidance that we were offering was around how we make that assessment of risk. And that assessment of risk also includes transmission of a virus. So how do we balance that? There was very little conversation in any guidance that was produced around how you balance that risk. And in fact, some of the submissions that we put through to the Scottish Parliament through the Scottish Association for Social Workers actually made that very point. Actually, there should be more attention paid to balancing of risks on an individual basis.
Thank you very much, Professor. Looking at at BASWA's reflections and recommendations for the future, can we look, please, at paragraph 178 of your witness statement, which is at page 40? And looking at these, in fact, much of what you have said about PPE and the focus on the implications for home visits of a lack of PPE is prominent among your recommendations. And similarly, at 178G, the guidance that you suggest should have been considered on moving between homes. In terms of planning for a pandemic, we see at 178E your suggestion that emergency planning for future pandemics and other national crises should prioritise children's services and recognise the unique statutory responsibilities of the social work profession. Can you help Professor Barron with any specific aspects of pandemic planning that you say would prioritise children's services?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would recommend is that actually social work as a profession is recognised as being central to any pandemic planning measures that are put in place. It was quite clear that social work wasn't present. There was a lack of understanding about how social work works and how social work is organised. There was consistently mixed messages between social work and social care, and obviously one of the differences is around statutory responsibilities between social work and social care. And I think at the most highest point of pandemic planning, we need to put social work at the forefront of that. That's then about balancing children's rights, the rights of families within that situation, and obviously the same point was also made in the adults module.
And what would it look like to prioritise social care in pandemic planning? Would that be in terms of consultation, guidance that differentiated?
Do you mean social work or social care?
Social work.
Yeah, sorry. No, it's actually about having social workers available at minister level. We have senior civil servants, social workers across the whole 4 nations, actually strengthening their position in government so that actually they can give guidance and they actually form part of emergency planning systems. In a previous role I had in a local authority as one of the directors for social work, I was very central to emergency planning at a local authority level, and I think that model should be adopted across national government.
Very helpful. Thank you, Professor. My lady, those are all my questions. Do you have any questions?
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. I'm really grateful to you for your help and obviously grateful to all your colleagues for the excellent work they try to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Can I just pay tribute, actually, and a huge thank you to all those social workers who've worked tirelessly and very committed to children and families and continue to do so.
Thank you. Very well, I shall return at 2:15. All rise.